Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to Next Door NetAdmin. I have had a dickens of a time coming up with something to talk about this week, largely because I've been too busy at work to put any thought into things. So, I know I said that we were done with our ACME deep dive, and that's still true, but I thought I'll do one last follow-up to show you guys some of the tools and handy helpers, let's say, that I use when I'm busy working on SSL in general, certificates and such. First tool I'm going to show you is a certificate search engine. And this browses the certificate transparency logs. If you don't know what those are, when a certificate is issued, many certificate authorities will register that certificate in the certificate transparency logs, which are run by third parties. Google has some of the biggest ones, for example. And those logs are there so that anybody can run a search on what certificates have been issued so that you can review the certificates issued for a particular domain and verify that nobody's been issuing certificates without your knowledge. Useful. But the certificate search engine that I'm going to show you is also really, really useful for being able to look at the structure of a certificate and being able to see visually what all information is in there. So that's going to be one of the things that I show you. I would also be remiss if I did not include the Qualys SSL Labs tester. And this is something that I use to review websites when I've configured them to make sure that I've got solid settings, I haven't missed anything. It's also something that I will occasionally use to examine another website that I have not had any hand in configuring. You can use it for troubleshooting the SSL negotiation process. In addition to having a certificate, one of the important parts in SSL is having a matching list of ciphers on either end. And if there isn't a compatible match, then SSL will fail, because it can't negotiate a matching cipher on both ends. So using this tool will allow you to get a good idea of what ciphers are being offered by a remote site that you don't have the ability to just look at the configuration for. Third tool I'm going to show you will be the Mozilla SSL Configuration Generator. This is a tool that is maintained by Mozilla, makers of Firefox, Thunderbird, a few other products in there. And it has a lot of tweakable settings, shall we say, that will then output a list of recommendations, recommended settings that you can put into whatever your server software is. Now, this is not a Windows tool. This is very much for the Linux/Mac folks. Starnix. I don't know why I just don't use that term. So you can configure it for Apache, you can configure it for Nginx, you can configure it for some FTP software. There's a whole list. And they kind of break down the settings into, I think it's old, intermediate, and modern. Might be legacy instead of old, I don't remember. But the long and short of it is, based on which clients you're planning on supporting, if you only need the most modern clients supported, you can go with a modern configuration. If you kind of want something that is up to date security-wise, but still allows a fair number of older clients to work with your configuration, then you'd go with intermediate. Intermediate is suggested. It's what I typically go with. If you have very, very specific needs to support legacy or older clients, then the legacy configuration might be what you need. But it's not generally speaking, as secure as intermediate or modern is. So you would probably want to put some additional technological measures in there to make sure that everything works in a secure fashion. The fourth tool I'm going to take a look at is a Windows tool, and that is IIS Crypto. Despite the name, IIS Crypto is not just for people using IIS, the web server that comes with Windows. IIS Crypto is better understood as just a tool for manipulating the registry settings in Windows to do some of the same things that the Mozilla SSL configuration generator could do on a *Nix side. Except in Windows, in order to control the availability of ciphers and other such detailed parameters, you really need to use the registry. Doing that manually is painful. So IIS Crypto is a wonderful tool that you can use to set the registry to the configuration that you want. These are just tips and tricks of the trade, essentially. So let's get started, and I'll show them to you. All right, this is the first tool that I said I would show you, a certificate search engine. Also handily named such that you can pronounce this search. You are going to search for certificates here, crt.sh. You can enter an identity. Typically, we would use a domain name. You can also enter a certificate fingerprint if that's what you have. If we take a look at the domain for which I issued the test certificates in the previous ACME deep dive, you can see that we've got 3 different certificates here. Now, you're looking at this and you're going, I see 6 entries. What do you mean there's 3? Well, if you'll note, these are all paired. We have 2 certificates that I issued for test and 1 that I issued for test 2. And I'm actually going to open both of these for test 2 so that we can see what the difference is. This one is a pre-certificate. This one is a leaf certificate. Now, a leaf certificate in this case is the actual end entity certificate that we're talking about. A pre-certificate, on the other hand, is a certificate, sort of. It's one that's issued in advance so that the certificate transparency logs can sign it, and then when it is signed, the actual signed entries for the signed certificate timestamp get added to the actual certificate that's issued. You can't get a signed timestamp without submitting something to the logs, so you have a pre-certificate here. But otherwise, they are largely the same. If you look through this, you can see, yeah, we've got key usage for web server authentication, web client authentication. You can see the authority information access, which gives you information on the certificate authority and any OCSP responders. You can see the subject alternative names, including any other domain names that this certificate is valid for. And you can see here that this is pre-certificate poisoned. Anything that has this pre-certificate poison field is not valid for actual use in an SSL negotiation. But then if you go to the actual certificate, like I said, much the same. Serial number, signature algorithm, issuer, validity. This one, though, has the signed certificate timestamps showing that it's been submitted to Google Argon. It's been submitted to DigiCert Yeti. These are both certificate transparency logs. They have included their signatures over their log IDs. And then this is the actual signature from the certificate authority. This is kind of what it looks like on the back end. And occasionally you can take a look at something and figure out something that's gone wrong, or you can figure out other things such as, hey, this has a bunch of other domain names on it. I wonder if those ones are configured in the same fashion. Speaking of configuring in the same fashion, the second tool I'm going to show you is the Qualys SSL Labs server test page. sslabs.com/SSL test. This gives you a lot of information about how a particular web server is set up. And a lot of times you might choose to tick this box that says do not show the results on the boards if it's something that you aren't sure about how well you're doing. Maybe you don't want that information public, maybe you don't care. But when you enter a host name there, and I'm actually going to choose one of these in the recent best just to save ourselves some time. The actual analysis can take a few minutes, and I don't want to bore you with that. But when you have the test completed, you'll get an overall rating, you'll get an idea of how strong you are, your configuration rather, is in various areas. But then you get to the juicy details. Certificate number 1. It's an elliptic curve certificate, 384 bits. It's using an SHA 256 with RSA signature. You can see, yes, it is using certificate transparency, when it's valid from, when it's valid until. Does it have OCSP must staple? No. Is there a DNS CAA record? No. Is it trusted? Yes. Okay. Then you'll see additional certificates, because you never get just one certificate unless it's the root. Your web server is supposed to send the leaf certificate as well as any intermediates along the way, but not the root certificate. So this is the intermediate certificate for R3, which is coming from the Internet Security Research Group, Let's Encrypt. And if you open the certification paths, this one was sent by the server. This one was sent by the server. The root is in the trust store already and should not generally be sent. And you can check the certification paths for various operating systems and know that everything is good. Continuing on, we see that this supports TLS 1.3 and 1.2, nothing older. That's good. We can see the cipher suites that are configured for this website. That's also useful. And then you get into handshake simulations for various operating systems and browser combinations. You can see which ones will just fail completely, and you can see which ones will work very nicely. And you can see this one will use TLS 1.2 with HTTP 1.1. These ones will use TLS 1.2, but they'll upgrade it to HTTP 2 because this particular website has HTTP 2 support. Then you've got a bunch of really old iOS versions and Safari versions that will just die completely. Protocol details, a lot of this is good. Anytime you see green, it's good. Anytime you see orange or yellow, it's a warning, something to look at, see if you can figure it out. If it's red, that's definitely a security risk. So as you adjust things, you will be able to rerun the test and see how it goes. And you would be able to rerun the test if you scroll back up to the top. If you hit clear cache, it will run the test again. Or you could hit scan another to go back to the index page and choose a different host name to scan entirely. But this gives you a lot of in-depth information that you can use to troubleshoot or tune your configuration appropriately. Next up, the Mozilla SSL Configuration Generator. Like I said, lots of options to tweak here. You can choose your server software, whether that's light TBD, or whether that's postfix or SQL. I'm sticking with Apache just for the sake of showing you something specific. And it is modern, intermediate, and old. like I said, this should only be used as a last resort. Intermediate is for general purpose systems, and it is recommended. The server version, you can actually change the version here to a different version so that you can make sure that you have the most the most up-to-date version. Or if you're using something that has an older version of software, you can get something that is compatible a little further back in time that still satisfies these particular desires. OCSP stapling is a good thing to support. HTTP strict transport security, good to have, and you'll get top marks for it on the SSL server test if you have it. But it's important to know the consequences of checking this box. If you use HTTP strict transport security, browsers will essentially say, okay, I understand that the admin is telling me that it wants me to only use HTTPS. And if the certificate fails verification or there is something else wrong with the site, don't load it at all. Not even if the admin tells me to. This is essentially a one-way gate. And so if you break something in your configuration and you had this set, then people just won't be able to load your website or whatever software you're running, whether it's a proxy, whether it's a mail server, whether it's a database. If you have this set, you got to be really careful that you know what you're doing and you're committing to never taking SSL off this site. Because if you take SSL off this site, nobody will be able to connect to it for another 6 months, because that's a typical duration for how long this setting lasts. So then it'll give you snippets that you can insert into your configuration, including SSL protocol. You're using all of them, but then you're taking out the old and insecure ones. It'll give you your SSL cipher suites in the required naming convention. If you come over here, you'll notice that these all start with TLS and then have a bunch of parameters after it. These ones do not start with TLS. They just start with the algorithm name, and they're a little different. That's because these are TLS cipher suites, and you can see the parameters there. These are their OpenSSL names, depending on your version of OpenSSL. And so there's a little bit of translation that needs to be done there because of the different names that both protocols use for them. They're the same algorithms, you just need to know which name you're using for which software. And then you have the other parameters that are suggested in there as well. What happens if you take the HTTP strict transport security setting off? Well, we lost a section of our configuration. This one is a rewrite that just rewrites everything from insecure to secure traffic. But then this also has header always set strict transport security, max age, yada yada yada. And the other thing it removed, I think, was protocols H2, which is odd. No, it still has protocols H2. I guess I'm just seeing things. Isn't that fun? But yeah, if you want to go to modern, you can see it changes a lot of things. For example, in modern, we're also disallowing TLS version 1.2. We're not specifying any ciphers because all of the ciphers in TLS 1.3 are secure, and there's only 3 of them. Whereas in TLS 1.2, you have to limit the ciphers available because TLS 1.2 had a lot of ciphers available. Some have been broken, some have not. So you need to manually specify which ciphers you'll want for that. Clear as mud? Cool, let's keep going. The last thing, IIS Crypto. This is written by Nartak Software. It does update when necessary for new versions of Windows. It can be a little slow sometimes, but if you hit the GUI and download that, it is just a single executable. You do not need to install it. You do not need to do anything specific with it. It looks like this. I have already used this tool to customize the SSL settings on my test server here. If you loaded it up without ever having touched it before, a lot of these would look like they're grayed out, and that just means that it's at default settings. Then you can check it or uncheck it however you want. And you can say, okay, I want these protocols, I want these ciphers, I want hashes, key exchanges, client protocols. And you can also manually set your cipher suites, move them up and down in preference, select them, deselect them, whatever you want. But there's a lot of details here, so I will usually go to templates. This comes built in with a few different templates. You might be tempted to go for best practices. Best practices is a little out of date in my opinion, or at least it has been. So I will often go with PCI 4.0 if you're doing something that specifically needs to be PCI compliant. Or you can even go to strict, which disables TLS 1.0 and 1.1. It disables any non-forward secrecy ciphers. This is what I would typically use these days myself, because even though this is strict for the Windows world, it's actually a pretty good match to the intermediate settings that you get from the Mozilla SSL configuration generator. When you have, and then if you select that and hit, no, you don't have to hit apply yet. I was almost going to tell you something wrong. If you select a template here and then go back to your S channel or cipher suites, this is what it'll look like for just server defaults. Everything is just the way it normally is. Cool. If you go to best practices, then you can take a look and say, oh, well, best practices includes TLS 1.0 and TLS 1.1. Nobody's using that these days in a secure context. So I wouldn't recommend you use that either. That's why I'm like, best practices is not best practices to me. The only major differences between PCI 4.0 and strict is these additional cipher suites. We have an AES 256, 128. We have a bunch of ECDHE with RSA, as well as those. If we go back to strict, you can see that we've still got the GCM AES suites. We have a couple ECDHE RSA, but only the ones that are using GCM. I'm going to switch back to PCI 4.0 for a second, because you can see under PCI 4.0 you have some CBCs as well as GCM. GCM stands for Galois counter mode. I do not need to go that deep into the math, but GCM is faster, it is more performant, and it is better for parallelization. CBC is cipher block chaining mode, where every block of encryption relies on the previous block in order to verify that everything's good. This is reasonably secure, but it relies very much on getting an unbroken stream from beginning to end, because you can't decrypt anything towards the end if you don't have every single block that came before it. So for that reason, it's a little more taxing. There's more packets that need to be reassembled in order to decrypt the communication. It's recommended these days that you stick wherever possible to Galois counter mode, GCM, because it can be better parallelized. So that's what I have here, and that's why I use strict. When you hit apply, that saves your changes in the registry. This tool will not reboot the computer unless you have the reboot option ticked. So you can apply these settings without rebooting, but they will not take effect until you reboot the computer. So get it the way you like it, apply it, then reboot the computer, and you'll be using the settings that you set here. And that's basically everything that I had to show you. There you go. We've gone through all 4 of the tools and tips and tricks that I had there to show you. Hopefully, these make your work with SSL and certificates in general a little more rewarding and a little easier along the way. So I guess thank you very much for joining me on this postscript to our ACME deep dive. I am your next door netadmin. Thank you very much for watching. We'll see you later.